Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova, everyone. I remember when I was a boy, maybe 11 years old in 1965 or 1966, sitting in this sanctuary. Actually, I'm not in this sanctuary, even though it looks like it, but I remember that sitting in the sanctuary at Temple Beth Hillel in my jacket and tie next to my dad, listening to the rabbi give his sermon. And that's what we called it back then, 55 years ago, a sermon, not a drash. Reform Judaism was much more reformy 55 years ago. And I think the rabbi was Rabbi Forstein, and he gave a sermon about our obligation to support the civil rights movement. And that sermon must have made a great impression on me because I still remember it to this day. So here we are 55 years later. I'm the rabbi, not a young boy in the congregation, and I'm giving a drash, not a sermon, but it's the same idea. And I have to say that right now, I feel like very little has changed in 55 years. Of course, some things have changed. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were both passed, and they expanded the vote and ended the most blatant forms of racial discrimination. And for a time, both the federal and the state governments created affirmative action programs that were designed to eliminate the most blatant racism in college admissions, in government hiring, in government contracts, to address 150 years of targeted legal discrimination against Black people. And we've had a Black president. But just as quickly as those remedies were created, we started to chip away at them. Almost from its inception, affirmative action was dismantled. There were Supreme Court decisions like the Bakke decision in the 1970s that demanded that race could not be a criterion for graduate school admissions. In the 1990s in California, the voters passed Prop 209, which prohibited the government from considering race, sex, or ethnicity in public employment, in education, in contracts. The idea was even 2 or 3 or 5 years of affirmative action placed an undue amount of suffering on white people, when of course the point of affirmative action was to end 400 or 500 years of suffering for Black people. And finally, voter suppression, which has been practiced with more and more skill over the last 2 decades, has rolled back the Voting Rights Act with, in the words of the Supreme Court, laser-like precision. So here we are, it's September 2020, 55 years after the little Jewish boy listened to his rabbi's sermon, and our nation is racked by a drumbeat of unarmed Black people being shot by the police and by private citizens, and it's unleashed demonstrations across the country. And it's easy to think about the people being shot as statistics, but each one of them is a human being. Let me read you a few of their names so we reaffirm their humanity, their dignity. George Floyd, 46. Breonna Taylor, 26. Alatiana Jefferson, 28. Ora Rosser, 40. Stephon Clark, 22. Botham Jean, 26. This one really breaks my heart. He was sitting in his apartment in Houston eating ice cream when an off-duty police officer entered his apartment by mistake, was surprised that he was there, and killed him. Philando Castile, 32. Alton Sterling, 37. I could go on and on. And let's not forget Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old teenager who was shot by George Zimmerman, a private citizen, when he was walking home from a convenience store after buying some soda and a box of Skittles for a treat. Or Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot and killed by 3 men while he was jogging through their neighborhood. Every time I think about a young Black man or woman shot and killed by the police or by private citizens, I think that could have been my son, or that could have been my daughter. Each of them had parents, grandparents, family, hopes, dreams, an entire universe. And that universe is ended. And then I begin to feel just a tiny bit of the pain their family must feel, and it breaks my heart. Now, at this point, you might be asking me, Rabbi, what does this have to do with our Torah portion this morning, which is the binding of Isaac, or the Akedah? And it's a legitimate question, so let me try to answer it. Near the end of our story, there's a moment just before Abraham is about to kill Isaac. The knife is raised, he's ready to use it, and an angel cries out, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham responds, Hineni, here I am. And then the angel says, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. And our Torah portion continues. When Abraham looked up, his eyes fell upon a ram caught in a thicket. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering for his son. My question is, was the ram always there, or did it appear miraculously after the angel cried out to Abraham? In other words, was the solution to Abraham's unbearable dilemma always present? Was it always in front of him all the time or not? I like to think it was always there. And one answer that confirms this is from Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 6, where we read that the ram was one of the 10 miraculous creatures that God created on Erev Shabbat, on the first week of creation. And the ram had always been on Mount Moriah, waiting for this moment. Rabbeinu Bachya, who was a Spanish Torah commentator who lived from the mid-13th to 14th century, writes this. The plain meaning of the text is that after the angel had told Abraham not to touch Yitzchak, he saw this ram. In other words, the ram was always there, but Abraham couldn't see it. It was only after the angel cried out that was possible. Until then, the ram was invisible. Perhaps he was too distraught by what God had commanded him to do. Perhaps he was blinded by his commitment to his task. Regardless, his vision was too narrow. He couldn't see what was in front of him. And in this reading, the story of the Akedah is a story about perception, what we can see and what we can't see, what we choose to see and what we choose not to see. And our cell phones are like the angel. They cry out to us and they enable us to see what's always been there, the violence against people of color. Now, everyone has a camera in their pocket, and all these events are being documented. And it happens so regularly, we have to call it what it is, systemic. When we face a serious flaw, a serious sin, it's normal and natural to make excuses. Here are some of the ones we make as a society. The vast majority of police are good people. It's just a few bad apples. I think that's probably true, but it doesn't matter. If it were Jews being killed on a regular basis, would we accept that answer? And how many bad apples are acceptable? How many killings of innocent people is our society willing to tolerate? Here's another excuse. Most of the people who were shot were criminals, or they were in the act of committing a crime, or they didn't obey the police's commands as they should. Some of that's debatable, but let's assume it's all true. Again, it doesn't matter. Selling loose cigarettes, passing a counterfeit bill, having a burnt out taillight are not capital crimes. And the police are the police. They are neither judges nor executioners. The Jewish tradition is very clear on this topic. Unnecessary killings by legally constituted authority are considered to be murder. And police violence is just one example, the most painful and egregious of a network of racism. I remember reading an article in early September, in the business section actually, about how assessors, regardless of where, from Virginia to California, consistently undervalue the homes of Black people when they're put on sale. It was so interesting that one Black attorney, when she got an assessment that was about 30% below the value of her neighbors, took all the pictures of her family out of the house. Her husband is white, put pictures of his husband's family up in their place, and got a 40% higher assessment on her house. Now, I guarantee you that those assessors are good people. They're not consciously racist. They didn't even know they were doing it because they have biases. We all have biases. The ram is right here in front of us. Are we willing to see it? My dad used to tell me a story that when he arrived in America, in New York, in the harbor in 1947, he and my mom and my older sister, who was just tiny then, stepped off the boat, and a Black man came, took their bags, put it on his cart, wheeled it out to the taxi that was waiting to take them. And in that moment, my father understood racism in America. Here he was, fresh off the boat, not in America for more than 10 or 15 minutes. And he was being served by a man whose family had lived here for generations. Now, my father was acutely aware of what it meant to be persecuted. He had fled the Nazis, and even before that, he had grown up as a second-class citizen in Czechoslovakia, where discrimination and hatred and violence against Jews was a regular part of his life. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are about change. They're about opening up our hearts and having the courage to become the best version of ourselves. And it's just as true of our country as it is of us. And the Rambam teaches us that the first step of tshuva, of repentance, is admitting we have done something wrong, that we have caused harm, and to feel remorse. We need to see the ram in the thicket and drop any excuses. We live in our society where our fellow citizens are treated as inferior to us because of the way they look. And it pervades almost every aspect of their lives, from education outcomes to job prospects to health to lifespan. As Jews, what is happening in our country should cut straight to our hearts. We know what it means to be targeted for who we are. It's part of our history. We've benefited from America's obsession with race because of the way most of us look. And so we've been accepted as white, as opposed to Europe with its obsession on religion, where we were always treated as the other, no matter how hard we tried to integrate into European society. So 55 years later, I'm asking all of us to open our hearts and make a commitment to take action to change this systematic oppression of Black people. Let's begin by seeing the ram caught in the thicket. Let's admit to ourselves that we benefit from the way our country is set up at the expense of others. It's a painful fact to admit that our society abuses its citizens, our fellow citizens. The problem is huge and it can be overwhelming, and it makes me freeze up because, after all, what can one person do? And in those moments, I hear the words of Rabbi Tarfon from Pirkei Avot. He said, "The day is short, the work is great, the laborers are tired, the reward is great, and the master of the house is insistent." And he also used to say, "It's not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you free to neglect it." I know that there are people, members of our congregation and in the wider community, who are already taking action. And every act is an act of tshuva. And any action, if applied consistently, brings the redemption one step closer. And I'm probably one of the worst offenders. I'm slow to change and I'm slow to act. But since the summer, I've been doing a few things of my own, cultivating a relationship with the Easter Hill Methodist Church, developing personal relationships, and I'm making a commitment to act now and to continue to do so. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says, "The way we act and the way we fail to act is a disgrace that cannot go on forever." This is not a white man's world. This is not a black man's world. It is God's world. God became manifest in the world through the voice of an angel and a ram caught in a thicket. The ram that Abraham was finally able to see and enabled him to save himself and his son. The message here is that clear vision can lead to salvation. Let's commit on this Rosh Hashanah, in this coming year, and in the years to come, through our actions, to make God manifest in the world.